Grand economic theories rarely last more than a few decades. Some, if they are particularly in tune with technological or political events, may make it to half a century. Beyond that, little short of military force can keep them in place. The wild open market theory that died in 1929 had a run of just over 30 years. Communism, a complete melding of religious, economic, and global theories, stretched to 70 years in Russia and 45 years in Central Europe, thanks precisely to the intensive use of military and police force. Keynesianism, if you add its flexible, muscular form during the Depression to its more rigid postwar version, lasted 45 years. Our own globalization, with its technocratic and technological determinism and market idolatry, had 30 years. And now it, too, is dead. Of course, grand ideologies rarely disappear overnight. Fashions, whether in clothes or food or economics, tend to peter out. Thousands of people have done well out of their belief in globalization, and their professional survival is dependent on our continued shared devotion to the cause. So, is their personal sense of self-worth? They will be in positions of power for a few more years, and so they will make their case for a few more years. But the signs of decline are clear, and since 1995 those signs have multiplied, building on one another, turning a confused situation into a collapse. We have scarcely noticed this collapse, however, because globalization has been asserted by its believers to be inevitable and all-powerful God, a holy trinity of burgeoning markets, unsleeping technology, and borderless managers. Opposition or criticism has been treated as little more than romantic paganism. It was powerless before this surprisingly angry God, who would simply strike down with thunderbolts those who faltered and reward his heroes and champions with golden wreaths. If globalization has seemed so seductive to societies built upon Greek and Judeo-Christian mythologies, perhaps the reason is this bizarre confusing of salvation, fatalism, and punishment. Transferred to economics, in however jumbled a manner, these belief systems are almost irresistible to us. Welcome to Savvy Economists. Today we would be talking on the collapse of globalization and what Peter Zeihan has to say about this topic. As we go into the video, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn your notifications on.
Well, the world before globalization was a mosaic, tiny little local economies, and if you didn't have what you needed locally, you just did without. So if you didn't have oil, you didn't industrialize. If you didn't have food, you had a very small population. And the economies, the countries that had more would be able to use that power and leverage themselves into becoming empires. Those empires clashed, that brought us World War II, whole system collapsed. But with globalization in the late 40s and 1950s, the Americans created a strategic rubric where the little guy could actually get by, and the little guy could access the inputs and the outputs of other economic systems. And so instead of thousands of tiny little systems, we eventually migrated into a single huge one, where anyone could import or export anything to anyone at any time. That gave us global agriculture, that gave us global energy and finance, that gave us global manufacturing supply chains, and ultimately created the world that we know. But now we're deglobalizing for a mix of reasons, and we're going back in the direction of thousands of little disconnected systems, which means that the strength of the whole is now failing. And we're seeing that with the Ukraine war, and we're seeing that with the Chinese disintegration, and we're seeing that with some of the problems that the Western world is having as they try to unplug from Russia. This is where we're all headed. Oh, the end of globalization is going to be a disaster for most of the world. Most of the world cannot feed and fuel itself without either direct imports or the inputs that's necessary to allow them to feed and fuel themselves from another continent. You break that down, you're talking about food shortages that are global in scale that affect billions of people. You're talking about an end to manufacturers trade in the way that we know it, which basically strangles tech in the cradle. And you're talking about a collapse of the ability of energy from one region to reach another region, which Europe is discovering right now means the lights go out. These are not positive things. It doesn't mean that there won't be winners, as in any system, there will be winners and losers. But we've had a lot of winning in the last 75 years that's about to go away. There are two big pieces. First, globalization did not happen on accident. When the post-World War II system was being born, the Americans proposed that we would use our Navy, the only one to survive the war, to patrol the global ocean so that anyone could engage in any trade with anyone at any time. This is normally the sort of benefit that you would have only had if you were on the winning side of the war and you were an imperial power already. So we basically made the world open for everyone. And that allowed everyone to take manufacturing and services jobs and diversify and specialize and access anything from a world over. And once that became an option, people started taking those jobs. But all of those jobs are in the cities. And that changed who we are. Because in the pre-industrial, pre-globalized world, most of us were farmers, and small plot farmers at that. But once we could move into the cities and take those more value-added jobs, it changed how the way we thought of families. On the farm, kids are free labor. You have a bunch. In the city, kids are really expensive habits. You have very few. You fast forward 75 years, and it's not that we're running out of children. That happened 40 years ago in most of the world. We're now running out of adults. And so we're in a ever-accelerating population crash. So even if the Americans were willing to continue a 20th century strategic policy in a world where there's no longer a Cold War, we no longer have the population structure for consumption that allows globalization to work either. So whether it's the front end or the back end, this period in history is now over, and it's just a question of how we segue into whatever's next.
Advances in communication and transportation technology, combined with free market ideology, have given goods, services, and capital unprecedented mobility. Northern countries want to open world markets to their goods and take advantage of abundant, cheap labor in the South, policies often supported by Southern elites. They use international financial institutions and regional trade agreements to compel poor countries to integrate by reducing tariffs, privatizing state enterprises, and relaxing environmental and labor standards. The results have enlarged profits for investors but offered pittances to laborers, provoking a strong backlash from civil society. Globalization is not just about trade and technology. It is also about politics. Political change, above all the collapse of communism, created the conditions for an age of hyperglobalization. Now political change, above all rising nationalism, is threatening the dense network of economic ties built up over the last 3 decades. The enemies of globalization can be found across the political spectrum, from the nationalist right to the anti-capitalist left, and from the environmental movement to the intelligence services. It is true that deglobalization has not yet really shown up in the trade figures. As Alan Beatty pointed out recently, most standard measures of globalization, cross-border movements of goods, services, capital, data, and people, are doing pretty well. One possible conclusion to draw is that global economic connections and supply chains are now too intricate to be disentangled. While there may be a will to deglobalize, there is no real way. A sudden retreat into economic autarky by the world's leading trading nations would certainly cause chaos and hardship. But for all the upheaval involved, international economic ties can break down suddenly. Over the past 2 years, the pandemic and the Ukraine war have demonstrated how vulnerable international trade is to unexpected shocks. COVID-19 shut down global travel and disrupted supply chains. The war in Ukraine led to a rupture in the West's economic ties with Russia. And the combined political and social forces that are now pushing against globalization make it likely that there will be further shocks to come. A decade ago, protectionism was still a dirty word in U.S. politics, but the Trump administration started a trade war with China, and the Biden administration has kept the tariffs in place. A bipartisan consensus in the U.S. is now pushing for policies to reduce economic dependence on China and to repatriate key industries, in particular semiconductors. India has followed the decoupling trend, banning Chinese tech companies, such as TikTok, as a response to rising tensions with Beijing. The Chinese themselves are active participants in this process of decoupling. Arguably, they made the first significant move, with a drive to promote domestic production of key technologies. Beijing's Made in China 2025 policy was announced in 2015, before Donald Trump's election. When economic logic was more powerful than geopolitical rivalry, the dominant question was, where is it cheapest or most efficient to buy or produce? That led to the construction of intricate cross-border supply chains. But in a world in which international rivalries are growing, different questions are asked. Where it is safest to produce or buy? And should we even be trading with nations that we regard as a threat? The invasion of Ukraine has not just made it seem imprudent to rely on political rivals for key economic inputs, it has also allowed the West's national security establishment to seize the moral high ground from the free traders. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, says that freedom is more important than free trade. There are not many influential voices making the counterargument. The political and strategic arguments for cutting trade ties are increasingly supplemented by arguments about the environment and social resilience. After the pandemic, governments are reluctant to go back to a world in which the production of vaccines, say, or even rubber gloves, is concentrated in just one or two countries. Insisting on domestic production facilities, which once seemed inefficient, now looks prudent. As one senior industrialist puts it, we're moving from just-in-time to just-in-case. The potential vulnerability that is preoccupying national security establishments everywhere is semiconductors, crucial for everything from mobile phones to missiles. According to U.S. President Joe Biden, some 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are made in Taiwan by a single producer, TSMC. One senior U.S. official says that a Chinese invasion or blockade of Taiwan would create a semiconductor nuclear winter. Rectifying that situation could take many years, but the drive to do just that is now underway with the passage of America's CHIPS Act. The U.S. has long had rules that can restrict inward investment on national security grounds. The CHIPS Act creates new rules that will restrict outward investment, discouraging U.S. firms from making semiconductors in China. National security hawks believe that globalization meant that the Western democracies naively sponsored the rise of hostile rivals such as Russia or China. Left-wing critics associate the neoliberal era of globalization with widening inequality and environmental degradation. There are elements of truth to both of these critiques, but the pressure to cut trade and investment ties is not simply a product of rising nationalism and economic stress. It also contributes to both processes. For all the discontents that hyperglobalization has created, it is to be suspected that, in decades to come, the period from 1989 to 2022 will come to be seen as a golden age of peace and prosperity. The world may soon discover that globalization is the worst possible system, apart from all the alternatives. Some authorities argue that even though Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to a new round of predictions that the end of globalization is nigh, much like we saw at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, global cross-border flows have rebounded strongly since the early part of the pandemic. In our view, the war will likely reduce many types of international business activity and cause some shifts in their geography, but it will not lead to a collapse of international flows. What do you think about globalization? Is it a possibility that the world will be deglobalized or move ahead to becoming hyper-globalized? Let's know your thoughts in the comment section. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn notifications on.